Hello and welcome to Americans for Prosperity and our Facebook Live event today. In just a moment, we'll be talking with Congressman Bryan Steil. We'll be talking about things like government, jobs, infrastructure, and HR1. It should be a great conversation. Before we dive into that, though, my name is Ben Lee. I'm a regional director with Americans for Prosperity, and I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Eric Bott. Eric is the state director for Americans for Prosperity in Wisconsin. He's been in that role for 6 years. Under his leadership, that team has done some incredible things. We don't have time to get into all of that today, so just take my word for it. But Eric, why don't you introduce our guest?
Thank you, Ben. I'm excited to welcome Congressman Bryan Steil to join us at Americans for Prosperity today for this Facebook Live event. Congressman Steil has represented Wisconsin's first congressional district since 2018. That's far southeastern Wisconsin. He is co-chair of both the Middle Class Jobs Caucus and the Future of Work Caucus, where he focuses on providing high-quality family-supporting jobs to Wisconsinites, addressing our skills gap and our worker shortage. It's no wonder that Congressman Steil focuses so heavily on job creation. He spent over 10 years working in the manufacturing sector, Wisconsin's strongest business sector, before coming to Congress, and so is well equipped to help us address our challenges in that space. In addition to his focus on jobs, Congressman Steil has been a leader at combating human trafficking at the federal level and has been a hawk at trying to reform our budgeting processes, and heaven knows we need more of that now in Washington. Congressman Steil, thank you so much for joining us. And to kick things off, let's talk about spending. It's a hot topic. We as an organization talk to voters. We have events all over the state each week. We go door to door. We are constantly hearing from people now that they're worried about spending in Washington and they're worried about inflation. Are they right to have these fears? And what do you think about what's happening with federal spending at the moment?
Eric and Ben, first, thanks for having me on. Great to join you today to talk about this topic. And spectacular first question. Joe Biden is in Wisconsin today talking about his transportation plan. But what we've seen time and again from this administration is that the spending is not targeted, it's not focused. It's all about the Biden administration working with Nancy Pelosi to increase the size, scale, and scope of the federal government. And so you saw the first COVID bill go through. I'm going to put air quotes around COVID, where you saw $1.9 trillion in spending, very little of that to actually address COVID. Most of it, new government spending to increase the size, scale, and scope of the federal government. Now we're talking about this new transportation bill. Again, where very little of those funds are going to be directed in towards roads and bridges, our ports and our airports. Rather, a huge chunk of that money, as initially proposed, is to really increase the size, scale, and scope of the federal government. New liberal government spending in Washington. And the problem when you see spending at the levels that we've seen over the past year, and in particular over the past 6 months of the Biden administration, is that you see a flood of money coming into the economy. We're starting to see significant pressure from inflation. And inflation functions as a tax on all of us. So when prices go up, when the price at the grocery store goes up, when the price at the pump goes up, so you got to fill up your car, used car prices are up 17% this year, let alone new car prices. And so that's hitting people at the pocketbook. And so when Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi tell you they're not going to raise taxes, they're not going to negatively impact working families, their policies are just the opposite. They're hitting people in the pocketbooks. They're able to do less with the money that they have. And it's going to have real serious consequences if we don't right the ship.
Congressman Steil, just a moment ago, you mentioned the infrastructure package that's being discussed right now and how very little of that actually goes to roads and bridges. What are some of the things in that package that we should all be most concerned about?
Anytime you see a transportation bill like initially proposed by Joe Biden that isn't actually focused on transportation, every single piece of spending in a bill like that that's not really true infrastructure should raise your antenna. And so you're seeing all sorts of new social programs, things that can be debated. We can have a whole public debate about the role of the federal government as it relates to childcare or anything else. But when they're trying to put it under the guise of transportation, you got real problems with that. And so you're looking at a guise of transportation spending. And what they're really trying to do is increase the size and scale and scope of the federal government. They want to increase the scale of the scope of the federal government as it relates to childcare. And they're trying to put it inside these transportation bills at a period of time where the U.S. does have aging infrastructure. We do have needs to invest in our roads and bridges. But what you're seeing is the Biden administration putting a marketing plan in place by calling all of this new liberal spending transportation. And the Biden will be in Wisconsin today talking about this. I think it's really important that the mainstream media starts asking some questions and saying, why aren't you actually addressing the needs that we have on the ground? Why are you trying to take this bill and use it as a vehicle for new spending?
Yeah, good points, Congressman Steil. A little bit ago, you talked about inflation, which certainly is a real thing. Aside from that, though, the economy does appear to be growing. Unemployment continues to fall. Do we need another massive jobs bill right now?
No, so I'm not a Keynesian economist in general. So I don't think that you're looking for your federal government to create jobs. You create jobs in the private sector by getting the government out of the way. That's the best way to create jobs. The number one thing we could do to help people get back to work is, like I said, get the federal government out of the way. We've seen this plus up in unemployment benefits, paying people to stay home, discouraging workers to get back to work, to help us rip the Band-Aid off of COVID as we come back. The number one thing we could do is remove that government interference and allow workers to get back to work to address the workforce shortage that we have in Wisconsin, that we see across the country.
I'm so glad that you're not a Keynesian economist, Congressman Steil. That's music to my ears. Let's touch on labor policy for just a moment. You know, when I think of your district, I can't help but smile because I think of all the businesses and particularly manufacturers who have hopped across that Illinois border and come to Wisconsin. And I attribute a lot of that growth to pro-growth state policies enacted, particularly labor reforms over the last 10 years. Things like right to work or collective bargaining reform. And yet, despite the obvious success of these policies, Speaker Pelosi seems held back on undermining state labor policy. So we've seen bills like the PRO Act and now many of those provisions added to the infrastructure package. What do you think these assaults on state labor policy mean for your district? And do we have any chance of fighting back and defending what we've accomplished in Wisconsin?
I think it's critical that we keep policies in place and encourage employers to come to the state of Wisconsin. And you're spot on with that, Eric, that we've seen the benefits of the policies put in place after the 2010 election. As you look at what Scott Walker and Scott Fitzgerald and others put in place in the state of Wisconsin to right the ship. And we have the benefit of that now, and businesses are trying to get out of Illinois to get to Wisconsin for a couple of things. One, we got solid policies in place that we need to protect, in particular at the federal level, making sure that the federal government doesn't encroach and get in the way of economic growth in the state of Wisconsin. That's going to be absolutely critical. And then the second piece of that puzzle is businesses want to come to take advantage of our workforce, right? So we have the best workforce, not just really in the region or in the United States. We have the best workforce in the world in the state of Wisconsin, which is why companies from all over want to come to Wisconsin to hire our workers. The last piece of this puzzle is making sure that we're developing our workforce, preparing workers for the jobs of the future, and then fighting against the encroachment of the federal government that wants to come in and put in place policies that'll actually move us backwards and take these jobs back out of Wisconsin. And so we're fighting tooth and nail in Washington to make sure that Pelosi doesn't get her way, which would put kind of California-style work regulations in the state of Wisconsin, which would result in these businesses moving somewhere else. And you'd see unemployment rates going up. And so that's going to be the big battle here in DC, is keeping the federal government out of the way.
All right, welcome everyone. If you are just joining us, welcome to this Facebook Live event hosted by Americans for Prosperity. We are talking today to Wisconsin Congressman Bryan Steil. If you're enjoying what you're hearing, there's a link in the chat that you can click on. It'll help you take action, make sure that you get your voice heard on these important issues. Let's transition now to talk about H.R. 1. Congressman Steil, you have a unique role on the House Administration Committee. You're the ranking member of the subcommittee on elections. That gives you a unique seat and a unique perspective today to talk to us about H.R. 1. We like to call H.R. 1 the For the Politicians Act. It's a lot of election reform, campaign reform. One of the things that H.R. 1 would do is to create a system where they could funnel public dollars to finance politicians' campaigns. Is there any good reason why we should adopt such a system?
There's no good reason to adopt H.R. 1, but you are spot on. So I sit as the ranking member on the subcommittee on elections. And so in the House Administration Committee, we were on the front lines as H.R. 1 was working its way through to do exactly what you're saying, inform people about how bad this bill is, so that it doesn't actually get enacted into law. And I think what you just highlighted is what I actually think is probably the worst provision in the bill. And that worst provision is that it would take government money and put it into politicians' reelection campaigns, which is exactly why you correctly said the bill is not for the people, it's for the politicians. And so to give you an example of how this bill is drafted, it says that the federal government will match your donations at a 6-to-1 ratio. So if somebody wants to donate $200 to a congresswoman from New York City, naming no names, they give this congresswoman $200, she could turn around to the federal government and get $1,200, 6-to-1 match, for a total of $1,400 to then go run her reelection, to run negative TV ads, negative mailers, to hire political consultants. It's the exact opposite of what we should be doing with the federal government's money. We shouldn't be channeling it into politicians' reelection campaigns. I think it's one of the most egregious provisions of all the bad provisions that are in HR 1, which does a whole litany of stuff like gut voter ID laws. You can go down the list, but putting federal government dollars into politicians' reelection campaigns, I think is one of the most egregious provisions in the entire bill.
Totally agree. And again, if you're listening and you are fired up about HR 1, click on the link in the chat. That will help you take action and get your voice heard on that issue. Another thing that HR 1 does is it targets free speech and association, and it would chill civil discourse through this provision that would put the personal information of donors into a publicly searchable database if they give to issue advocacy organizations. Congressman, why is anonymous free speech and association such an important right and something that we should be protecting?
We got to protect our First Amendment. I mean, that's pretty clear. And what the Democrats want to do is they want to blame and shame all sorts of organizations. And we see this time and again. And so they're working aggressively to try to blame and shame Republicans and conservatives. You see the same techniques going on, whether or not it's big tech, they're trying to censor conservative thought. And so time and again, we're seeing this, and this is one of the battles where far too much of the mainstream media is on the far left. And we are in a process of trying to make sure that we can get our conservative voices heard. And so what you're seeing is the Democrats just putting forth another provision to name and shame conservatives, where what we need to be doing is being willing to stand up and have our voices heard.
Yeah, Eric, any questions from you on HR 1, or do you want to pivot to another topic? We have a few minutes left.
I guess one more thing to hit on HR 1. I'd be curious about your opinion. It's my understanding that it would effectively turn the Federal Elections Commission into a partisan organization. I mean, what are the dangers there? That seems like very troubling to me.
Yeah, that's another great identified issue here inside this bill. And so, of the litany of bad ideas, it would politicize the Federal Election Commission. It really would move it in the wrong direction. You don't want to have partisan bureaucrats trying to manage through these elections. And exactly what we see, where you've seen partisan Department of Justice get in the way as it relates to all sorts of election law in the past, in particular under Eric Holder, where you saw actions being taken, and then the Obama administration. And so it tries to politicize it. It does a whole litany of things. And I think one of the most egregious, we talked about a couple of them, is it guts voter ID laws. And so what it does is it mandates nationally that any state with a voter ID law, so you look at a state like Wisconsin, which has a pretty robust voter ID law, it would say all you have to do is sign a waiver and you're exempted from the voter ID law, effectively gutting it. So imagine going to buy a 6-pack of beer and saying, oh, I don't have my ID. And they say, well, that's simple. Just sign this waiver here as to who you are and you're good to go. That wouldn't happen. There's no way that's going to happen. Same way if you want to jump on an airplane. Oh, I forgot my ID, but don't worry, I'll just sign a waiver telling you who I am. That's not how that works. And so we have robust practices in Wisconsin with voter ID law to make sure that it's easy to vote, but hard to cheat, making sure that you can get a voter, you can get a photo ID if you don't have one, to make sure that you're eligible and able to vote, but also making sure that we don't completely gut these key voter integrity provisions in the law. And so HR 1 goes through as a whole series of bad ideas, like you just identified a handful of them. And this is what we're fighting for day in and day out. And sitting as the ranking member on the subcommittee on elections, we're really at the forefront of this debate. Just last week, Eric Holder came in to testify before our committee. And I was able to really point out how partisan his operation is. He more or less conceded that their IRS filing was pretty clear. The purpose of his organization was to reelect Democrats. And so I would encourage people to go back and watch that exchange between Eric Holder and I, because now as HR 1 is starting to get onto the back burner, if we can hold on in the United States Senate, the next bill that Democrats are trying to move forward is HR 4, which is another attempt by the Democrats of trying to have our elections taken over by Washington, D.C. And that's not the direction that we want to go.
Well, I appreciate your steadfast opposition to HR 1. And for those activists who are watching us on this Facebook Live event, please take action. I mean, you've heard it directly from the congressman. This is a direct threat to our freedom of speech, to the integrity of our state elections, and while simultaneously enriching the campaign accounts of politicians. It is not for the people, it is for the politicians. One more question with the couple of minutes we have left, Congressman. I wanted to turn the floor over to you to talk about an issue I've heard you speak of in the past, and I know you're passionate about. You ran for the first time, and you've continued to talk about budget reform and the need to improve how we function and spend money in Washington. What can we do to help make things a little better?
Eric, we first met years ago when I was working in the manufacturing industry in Southeast Wisconsin. So I worked for a little over a decade for a couple big employers and manufacturers in Southeast Wisconsin. I think the one thing you learn if you worked in a manufacturing setting is the process is so absolutely critical to create a good product. And if you're in a factory and you're running the line and all of a sudden you got bad product coming out of the end of the line, the first thing you do is stop the process, figure out what's going wrong, and fix the process to get a better product. And what Washington, D.C. does is the exact opposite. So Washington, D.C. continually produces a bad product, meaning almost nobody walks away and says, you know, this federal budget process and the federal budget is really a good product at the end of the day. There's vast room for improvement, but nobody wants to do the hard work, which is how do we dig in and reform the process to get a better result? And so being from Wisconsin, I think of a couple things that we do in our state that the federal government could learn a lot from. One is we should slow everything down. The state of Wisconsin budgets every 2 years. It gives a little bit more time and opportunity to think through how you're going to spend your funds, but also to provide oversight to say, how well did that program work? To sit back and analyze that spending to determine, was that really a good use of taxpayer dollars? And if it's not, take it out of the budget. And so slowing the process down like we do in the state of Wisconsin, budgeting every 2 years would be a great step in the right direction. The other is we have this game in DC where everybody tries to threaten that they're going to shut down the federal government. Everybody walks away as a loser in that scenario. And so the state of Wisconsin has a process that just continues spending at last year's level, which actually on the grand scheme isn't all that bad. It says that there's no increase, it's flat, it stays the same. It's not perfect because you got some hiccups. You do want to make changes as to what your spending priorities are from year to year, but it's better than shutting the federal government down, because what the federal government does is one person will say they want to spend on NASA, one person will say they want to spend on the national parks. They'll come at each other, they'll threaten each other, and then they spend on both, rather than ever making the difficult decision of what is the spending priority this year. And so what I'd love to see us do is put in place, remove the ability to do an absolute shutdown, put in place a policy where you'd spend at a flat level, which I think would be a better scenario than what we're seeing. Wisconsin has shown just that to be the case, that keeping it flat from last year is a better scenario than just spending on everybody's idea, which is simply just going to grow the size, scale, and scope of the federal government.
Congressman Steil, some great insights from you today. Thank you so much for joining us. We're just about out of time here. Thanks to all of you who are watching this Facebook Live event hosted by Americans for Prosperity. One more reminder to click on the link in the chat that will help you take action, make your voice be heard. Thanks for giving us a little bit of your time today. Thanks again to Congressman Bryan Steil. Have a great day, everyone.